I know very little about the Civil War, and like I know what started it and everything. That's the beginning of it is about what I know. I know a little bit about the middle. I have no idea how it ended. So Jeremy Suri and Lex Fridman are gonna Friedman. I don't know. They're gonna tell me how it ended, or us, whatever.
How did the war end in quotes? What was you said, and you make this case in the book, that in some sense, the elements, the tensions behind the Civil War continue to this day. But officially, how did the war end?
So officially, the war ends at Appomattox in the early spring of 1865,
Mm.
when Grant has pretty much smashed Robert E. Lee's army.
That dude needs to do something about his hair.
Appomattox Courthouse is a small town in Virginia, and the two men meet, and their portraits of this as a painting of it we have in the book. And Grant and Lee sign a paper which basically allows Lee's soldiers to leave the battlefield and leave with their sidearms to go back home. That's pretty much the end. Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy, goes into hiding. He's later captured and then not convicted. But there's no formal settlement in the way there is at the end of World War II, where they meet in Yokohama Bay, the U.S. and Japanese leaders, and sign that. This is not that.
So, what stands out to you as brilliant ideas during this time and actions too of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln?
So I mentioned that his values. I think a number of the things that he does that are quite extraordinary. First, in emancipating the slaves. Now, the slaves were freeing themselves, but Lincoln recognizes that he needs more labor in the Union Army. And he recognizes that there's still a lot of resistance. And what he does is he makes the case for freeing the slaves based on the argument, not just of the moral value of that, but based on how that will benefit the North. He's able to convince non abolitionists to pursue abolitionist policies that by serving their own interests. What he's basically saying by 1863 or 64 is I can ask for more white soldiers, or I can bring in former slaves. Would you like me to take your son, or would you like me to put in? It's
Yeah.
the same thing Franklin Roosevelt does during World War II. He says we need to build more planes and more tanks, and I'm sending all the soldiers off to Europe. I've got all this African American population in the South. Wouldn't you like me to move them up to Chicago so we can win this war and build things in the factories? So Lincoln uses the war to move the country forward morally, even if at times he's convincing people by using other reasons. And I think that's great politics.
I guess that's one of the components of great leadership is is do the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Or
Publicly sounding wrong reasons, yeah.
find ways to move people. What we talked about before.
Mhm.
Different stories move different people. So you can tell different stories. He tells one set of stories to the religious leaders who are abolitionists and a different set of stories to the New York bankers. And that's leadership. You tell different kinds of stories to move people to a new position. The other thing Lincoln is really brilliant at is managing the international side of this. So one of the real dangers for the Union is that the British will come in on the side of the Confederacy. The Confederates expected the British would, because again, the Confederates were selling all their cotton to Britain.
Mhm.
And they knew that the British leadership, first of all, was very happy to work with slaveholding societies, even though they didn't have slaves. And number two, that they believed the Union was getting too strong and threatening the British in Canada.
Mhm.
So there were many reasons the British might have gone in with the Confederates. Lincoln mixes
Man, we should have took Canada then.
sticks and carrots with the British. He threatens them. And when the British actually try to send diplomats to negotiate with Southerners, he interdicts that. He basically initiates a quarantine of the South. On the other hand, he reaches out to them and tries to show that he wants better relations and makes the argument that they will actually benefit more from having the industrial capability of the Union on their side. So he's a very good diplomat.
He is considered to be one of the great presidents in the history of the United States.
Yes.
Are there ways that he failed? Is there things he could have done better?
So he failed in the ways that most great leaders fail, which is that he had a terrible succession plan. His vice president, who I spend a lot of time on in the book, Andrew Johnson, who is probably our worst president ever, Andrew Johnson had no business being anywhere near the presidency. Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator who did not secede. And so, even though he was a Democrat, Lincoln wanted to show that he was creating a unity ticket when he ran for reelection in 1864. This happens today, right? So, he put someone on as vice president who he didn't even like, but who he thought was politically useful. Problem is, when Lincoln was assassinated, this guy took over. Andrew Johnson was drunk at his own inauguration. The guy was a true drunkard. He was not prepared to lead in any sense, intellectually, politically, and he was against most of the principles Lincoln was for. And the irony is that when Lincoln is assassinated in April of 1865, Andrew Johnson takes over and he has all the war powers Lincoln had. That was not good planning by Lincoln. And we can look back on it now and say, even though Lincoln is the first president who was assassinated, he should have known that there were people coming for him. It wasn't inevitable that he'd be assassinated, but he should have had a backup plan for who would take over. Hopefully, some.
He probably did know, but he didn't know how to go about getting protection, and maybe the people who he could get to protect him were in on it also, so he just was fucked.
Someone who was capable of doing the job, and
Kind of
Andrew
like
Johnson was not
JFK.
capable.
So for me, for a person, if I were to put myself in Lincoln's shoes or anybody, any leadership position shoes, it is difficult to think about what happens after my death, after I'm gone, right? To plan well. But at the same time, if you care about your actions to have a long-term impact, it seems like you should have a succession plan that continues on the path, continues to carry the ideals that you've implemented. So I'm unsure why people don't do that more often. Like, I wonder how much Vladimir Putin spends percentage of time per day thinking what happens after he's gone to help flourish the nation and the region that he deeply cares for. I wonder, and it's the same as for other presidents,
Yeah.
Donald Trump, Joe Biden. They might think politically, like, how do I guarantee that it's another Democrat or a Republican? But do they think like visionary for the country? I don't know. I wonder.
I think that's very rare. And I think what I understand from the literature among business people who talk about this a lot
Right.
is what ends up happening is you become so powerful, you assume you're always going to be in power. You convince yourself of that. You convince yourself that the end is far away. And of course, for Lincoln, the end could have been far away. He was healthy. He was only in his 50s. He could have lived a lot longer. But it ended fast as it could. And my understanding is
That's about how it goes, man. You're here in 1 minute, and then you're gone the next.
that most
You never know.
Americans don't prepare their wills and estates, and it doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor. They assume things are just going to go on because it's not fun to think about this.
Yeah. But I feel like it's freeing. Like, you know what I did, which is interesting? Before I went to Ukraine, I recorded a video. I set up a whole thing where I record a video, like, what happens if I die? I record a video to release, and I gave my brother access to my passwords, and I gave him instructions. You're not allowed to look at this, but please publish this after if I die. And that made me. It sounds silly and ridiculous, but that made me feel free to do the best thing I want to do. It's like it's a liberating. So, like, I guess that's for your will, but also, like, do the best possible damn job you can. I feel like as a leader, having a plan what happens if you fail, if you die, if you or you lose some of the some of the power, some of the momentum that is driving you currently, that there's going to be a handoff where you will still be remembered as a great man or woman
But you identify one of the other problems, right? Which is one of the other reasons why someone like Lincoln or certainly Henry Kissinger doesn't create a successor, because you're afraid they're going to steal your passwords. You're afraid they're going to steal the power from you.
That's true.
You had to find someone, your brother, hopefully, who you could trust.
No.
But
let's just be clear. I love my brother, but he's a troll. So so there's a feature on on whatever password manager I may or may not use, and there's a bunch of services like this. It's interesting. I don't know if you know about this. I've learned about all of this. Is you can have them request access, and it's going to wait 30 days before it gives them access. So it's kind of has this built-in trust trust padding But it's interesting. I mean, to me, on that aspect, is just to have a plan in all aspects of life. This is for leadership in your private life. Like, what happens to not just your will and your wealth or whatever, but what happens to other stuff like social media and all of that
Right.
in this digital world is
And
fascinating.
anything you care about if you wanted
you care
to
about.
live on. And that's the problem. But unless you can devise a technical solution like that, you have to give someone power now.
Yeah, and that's the tricky thing. I mean, democracy is a kind of technology. You kind of have to figure out how to do it correctly, how to have that
You know, if you leave everything you make free and open source, then you don't have to worry about who gets it, because everybody gets it.
power propagate, and especially during war, how you get everybody together into this warmongering mood, or and then how do you like come down from that and just relax.
Precisely.
So in some sense, that's with Andrew Johnson. That was the problem is the over centralization of power.
It was the over centralization of power, but it was also that Lincoln had a designated successor who was going to do and tried to do everything that ran against what Lincoln was doing. And it set the country back. We went forward at the end of the Civil War, and then we went backward, more so than we would have if there had been a new election. Because if there had been a new election, there still would be reason for that person running, even if they were on the other side, to try to find some compromise positions. Andrew Johnson inherited power with very few limitations on how he used that power. Congress wasn't even in session. And so this became very directly a problem because Andrew Johnson started pardoning Southerners, allowing them to come back into power.
So he had like a few months where he just went wild.
Yeah. It's giving the car keys to someone who's not prepared to drive, but decided that they're going to do what they want with the car for a while.
All right. Is there any level to which power corrupted Lincoln, a war president?
Yes, I do think there were some areas. And I think that even though he was a great president, if not our greatest president, maybe one of the greatest figures of our history, he was flawed. One is his problem of succession, but also,
As is everyone.
I think Lincoln overinvested in the power of the presidency. He came to believe too much in the role of one man.
Yeah. The president's not the king.
And not in creating a more balanced approach to governance. And that's a function of war. That's where war is dangerous. War has an inherent centralizing power in a democracy. And that is dangerous because even when you have the best of people running a war, that gives them a lot of power to make decisions.
Yeah, how do you come down from that? I see that with Zelensky and Putin currently.
Yep.
It's a war. How do you come down? Because Ukraine and anybody in a war, kind of, especially if you're fighting for the ideal of democracy, it seems like war is anti-democratic.
It is.
So how do you come down from that? What's the interesting mechanism of? I mean, some of it is leadership. You have to be like a George Washington type figure, be able to walk away from power.
I think you gave the answer right there.
Yeah.
You need to walk away from power or you need to be forced to walk away from power. Historically, one of the things that democracies have tended to do when they have a chance is to vote out of office the victor in the war. Think about Winston Churchill. Roosevelt is elected to his fourth term when he's still in the war. It's not clear that he would have been elected again, let's say he lived on, because there is a sensibility that the person has become too powerful in this role and that someone else should now step in, someone else who's also not a war president but has other interests. So let's hope Ukraine wins this war. Zelensky should then step down or someone else should be voted in. It will be dangerous if he remains president. Let's say he wins somehow and a true victory, just as hypothetical. He should not be, he should be praised, maybe given a nice villa, but someone else should take over because the problem is that he's going to have too much power. And honestly, he's going to be too out of touch with what the country needs after the war.
What do you think would have happened if Lincoln had lived? That's the sort of counterfactual view of history. It's an interesting question that probably you think about a lot. This gets stories a lot. What would have happened if he didn't get assassinated?
It's a reasonable question because it was not inevitable he'd be assassinated.
Right.
He could have had more protection that night. He'd invited Ulysses Grant to go to the theater with him, and Grant and his wife didn't go. If they had been there would have been more protection for Grant. So you would have had at least double the security there. So there are many ways in which he might not have died. I think it still would have been a difficult transition, But I think there were a few things that would have been better. First of all, Lincoln would not have pardoned all of these Confederate leaders and allowed them to come back into power.
Lincoln was the sacrifice in the war, is what I'm gathering.
Lincoln also would have been a better politician at holding his Republican coalition together. And I think Lincoln was more committed to empowering former slaves and others. So we still would have had a lot of conflicts, but I think what would have been a degree of difficulty was doubled or tripled because Lincoln was removed and the opposite came into power with Andrew Johnson.
So you don't think there's a case you made that Andrew Johnson was turned out to be a bad decision, but the spirit of the decision is the correct one?
No, I think it was a terrible decision because you should never put someone one step away from enormous power who's not prepared.
Oh, in that sense.
Yes.
So, in that sense, I got it. But the spirit of the decision, meaning you put somebody who's represents a very opposing viewpoint than you.
Well, I'm for that so long as that person is on board with some of the basic values that you're pursuing and that person is capable of doing the job.
Well, do you think that was obvious to him that Andrew Johnson was not capable of doing the job?
Yes.
Okay.
It's in the I mean, everyone recognized that. But it made sense. I mean, what Lincoln has to be praised for is in the midst of a war, when at that point he was not doing well, the war was not going well, he ran for re-election. He didn't try to postpone the election. He didn't try to do anything.
Yeah.
And so he needed all the help he could get when running. And so he wanted to have someone on there who looked like a unity candidate who could appeal to some Southerners. So it made sense from a political point of view. But it created a really big problem. And there were people who said he should have removed Johnson as soon as he was elected. And in retrospect, he probably should have.
How gangster is that to during a war still run the election?
And it's extraordinary. I mean, Lincoln believed in democratic.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be what's going to happen if we have World War III. I think whoever's the president's going to try and stay in there. And I don't think that's right. I think you should do the gangster approach and have the election.
Values. He also believed he would win, but he knew it was not guaranteed.
Yeah.
And it's interesting for people who don't know this. The reason we have mail-in balloting in the U.S. is because of that. So, almost I think almost 1 million Union voters are away from their homes, and so how do they vote? As soldiers, as nurses, they vote by mail. The post office delivers their ballots. That's why we have mail-in balloting.
I didn't know that. Very interesting video. Pretty much Lincoln sacrificed, or was sacrificed. He didn't really sacrifice himself. He might have known he was going to be assassinated. But seems like he was sacrificed to end the war. So, great leader of all time. Even if he did some bad stuff, everybody does bad stuff.